You've arrived at CozySideAudio, where dreams begin with a story. Tonight's tale is here to help you wind down and find peace. If this brings you comfort, please like, share, and subscribe so more dreamers can join us. Let the night carry you, and let's begin.
CozySideAudio presents The Button Thief of Millbridge. Chapter 1. A Buttonless Morning. There were many ways to describe Millbridge, but urgent was never one of them. Perched on the edge of the northern coast like a teacup forgotten on a windowsill, the village had long since settled into the comfortable rhythms of a place that refused to rush. Life here flowed in soft, steady currents, the sea's patient sighing against the harbor wall, the rustle of lace curtains lifted by salt-kissed breezes, the daily rituals that stitched together 100 quiet lives. And at the center of one such life was Edna Bell, retired seamstress, once a maker of wedding dresses and now a connoisseur of calm. Every morning, Edna woke at precisely 6:30, not because she had to, but because she had always believed that the world showed its truest self in the early hours, before anyone had yet spoken a word aloud. She would draw back the curtains in her little kitchen with a practiced tug, watch the sea turn from iron gray to pewter to something nearly golden, and mutter something encouraging to the kettle as it began its faithful climb toward a boil. This morning, however, was not like the others. To begin with, Edna's knees had a new complaint. Not sharp, but low and persistent, like a cello note played on a rainy day. She muttered back at them, something about cod liver oil and stiff breezes, and padded toward the window to supervise the world. A slight creak in the floorboard by the sink greeted her, which she acknowledged with a nod. That creak had been there for 26 years. Any morning it failed to greet her would be cause for real concern. She poured her tea with reverence, allowing the chamomile to steep just long enough to become meaningful without veering into bitterness. She used a saucer, as always. Some lines of civilization were not meant to be crossed. And then she looked out toward the garden. It was a small thing, really. Barely enough to warrant a raised eyebrow, let alone a frown. But Edna Bell, who had sewn buttons onto garments for over 5 decades and could tell a shank from a flat back blindfolded, spotted it immediately. The buttons on her blue housecoat, 3 in all, gleaming mother of pearl, were gone. She blinked, set down the saucer, picked it up again, in case a second look would reveal them. No, still gone. The housecoat hung on the line just as she'd left it the afternoon before, swaying slightly in the gentle breeze. But where the buttons had once caught the morning light like opals from the sea, there now remained only thread tails, neatly severed. Edna opened the back door and stepped into the dew-damp grass. Her slippers darkened instantly, but she didn't notice. She reached out and examined the housecoat with practiced hands. The buttonholes were intact. The stitching that had once tethered the buttons was snipped cleanly, not frayed or pulled, but cut. She said. Not "oh no" or "good heavens" or any of the things a lesser observer might have exclaimed. Just a thoughtful, slightly narrowed She stood in the garden a while, one hand still holding the coat, the other reaching absent-mindedly into her cardigan pocket where her notepad always waited. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, in her careful, slanted script. April 14 subject, disappearance of 3 mother of pearl buttons garment, blue housecoat, cotton poly blend, handmade, circa 1997 weather, breezy, light drizzle overnight possible causes, wind, unlikely, buttons too well secured, animal interference, possible, investigate birds or squirrels, human mischief, to be considered next steps, observe further. Secure remaining garments. T. She underlined the last point twice. By mid-morning, Edna had changed into her walking clothes, wool skirt, blouse with pressed collar, coat with extra deep pockets, and was making her way into the village. She carried her woven bag and her magnifying spectacles, though she did not need them just yet, and walked with the easy rhythm of someone who had lived long enough to make peace with uneven pavement and the occasional overexcited spaniel. The village square was waking up. Children in uniforms gathered like sparrows near the school gates, shrieking in laughter or mutinous complaint. Mrs. Dory from next door was already berating the butcher about last week's too fatty bacon. Jem, the greengrocer's boy, was unloading crates of carrots that would never quite stand up straight, no matter how determinately he arranged them. Edna watched it all with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew every line in the script. But behind her smile, a question began to press gently against her thoughts. Who would steal buttons? Not coins, not handkerchiefs, not even a nice wool scarf, which she could have forgiven in this weather. But buttons. And only the buttons. Left the coat behind without so much as a wrinkle. It was, she decided, not theft in the traditional sense. It was something else. Something odd. And if she were being honest with herself, which she always tried to be, it was the most exciting thing to happen all week. At the Willow and Whisker Cafe, Edna found her usual table unoccupied. She sat down and removed her gloves with deliberation. Mavis, tall, broad-shouldered, and eternally wearing an apron with cats on it, came over with a smile. "Morning, Edna. Chamomile again?" "Yes, dear. And one of those scones with the currants, if they haven't all wandered off." "They've stayed put, I promise." As Mavis disappeared behind the counter, Edna drew out her notebook. She turned to a fresh page and titled it, Motive? Underneath, she began a speculative list. Sentimental attachment to buttons, collector, eccentric, secretive, bird using buttons to build nest, investigate, person unable to afford buttons but needing them. Then, below that, symbolic, a message? She tapped the end of her pen against her lip, then wrote in large, decisive letters, something to do with memory? By the time she had returned home that afternoon, Edna had asked 5 people about buttons, casually, conversationally, without any whiff of accusation. She had learned that Mrs. Caro Dog had once eaten a whole tin of plastic toggles and had to be taken to the vet. Buttons are no longer sewn on properly like they used to be, according to 2 shopkeepers and 1 man in the post office queue. Nobody had noticed any recent button thefts, but now that she mentioned it, hadn't Lottie from the bakery said something odd last week? This, Edna noted with interest. She spent the remainder of the afternoon in her sewing room. The room smelled of lavender and old wood, and the light slanted in through the window like a blessing. She selected 3 new buttons for the housecoat from her collection, none of them mother of pearl. One was shaped like a daisy. One had a tiny sailing boat painted on it. The third was a deep plum color, smooth and simple. She sewed them on slowly, allowing her thoughts to turn and shift like cloth beneath a needle. What did it mean to take a button? To Edna, buttons were not just fasteners. They were punctuation marks in the sentence of a garment. They were how you said something quietly, without words, about who you were, or at least who you hoped to be. A button chosen well could elevate an old cardigan to a statement. A button gifted was a kind of love letter. She still remembered the first button her late husband, Henry, had ever given her, wood-burned, shaped like a heart, meant for a coat she never finished making. She'd kept it, of course, in a jar, with others. That night, Edna stood again at the window. Outside, the village lights blinked into life one by one. Somewhere in the distance, someone played a harmonica poorly, but with heart. The housecoat hung once more on the line. She had left it there on purpose. She watched it sway gently in the wind and sipped her tea. This time, peppermint. Something a little sharper. Her eyes scanned the darkening yard, the slant of moonlight across the rose trellis, the quiet flutter of leaves. She stayed like that for a long while, eyes steady, thoughts sharper than her years might suggest. And when she finally turned away and made her way to bed, she felt a familiar spark, something she hadn't felt in ages. She hadn't meant to stumble upon a mystery. But now that she had, she wasn't about to let it slip away. Chapter 2. Tea Leaves and Theories. The next morning arrived not with fanfare, but with fog. Millbridge, tucked beneath its blanket of gray mist, looked like a dream someone had half forgotten. The harbor wall blurred into the sea. Chimneys coughed sleepily into the dawn. Somewhere near the lighthouse, a gull barked a single complaint and then thought better of it. Inside her little stone cottage, Edna Bell boiled water with the solemnity of a priest preparing communion. Today's tea was nettle and lemongrass, a blend she'd recently discovered in a catalog sent by mistake and decided to order on principle. She'd never been one to turn away an accidental offering. Some of her favorite things, in fact, had arrived that way. She steeped the tea, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and sat by the window. The housecoat, still buttoned with its new patchwork trio, fluttered faintly on the line. Still there. Still intact. She wrote a single word in her notebook. Unaffected. Then, after a pause, perhaps Thief has moved on or is testing patience. She underlined patience. It was something she had in good supply. After dressing, gray pleated skirt, wool vest, sensible shoes, Edna packed her bag with a few essentials: the notebook, a spare pencil, one folded kerchief, embroidered with her initials, and a biscuit wrapped in wax paper. Then she set off for what she liked to call the second office, a sunny corner table at the Willow and Whisker Cafe, near the window, behind the ficus with a slight lean to the left. By the time she arrived, Mavis had already set a teacup there with a saucer and a small pot of jam. "Your usual," Mavis said without waiting for a greeting. "And if you tell me again that your joints are forecasting drizzle, I shall insist you take my knee brace. It's not dignified, but it works." Edna chuckled, settling herself into the seat. "I'd rather suffer nobly than limp unflatteringly," she said. "But I do appreciate the offer." "I don't know what's nobler than walking upright," Mavis muttered, disappearing behind the counter. The cafe was a soft hum of morning conversation. Two fishermen in heavy knits discussed bait with the seriousness of philosophers. Mrs. Larkins from the bookshop was reading the paper and sighing in that way she did when the world displeased her, which it did on most days. The smell of warm croissants and cinnamon clung to the air like fond memory. Edna opened her notebook and, with the subtlety of a practiced eavesdropper, tilted one ear toward the table beside her. A pair of young mothers were chatting over cappuccinos. "I swear it's the third blouse this week," one of them said. "Every time I go to wear it, a button's gone." "Probably the washing machine," said the other. "Mine eats socks. Has a taste for wool, I think." "No, it's different," said the first. "They're just missing. Neatly gone." Edna's pen hovered over the page. She waited. But the conversation drifted elsewhere: school fees, play dates, the suspicious price of organic pears. Still, Edna felt her heart beat just a little faster. So it wasn't just her. That afternoon, she took the longer path home, the one that curved around the green and past the war memorial where children sometimes left dandelions. The mist had begun to lift, and Millbridge stretched itself slowly into the pale light of the day. Outside the post office, she spotted a familiar figure, Mavis, out of her apron and in her wool coat, reading a letter with her eyebrows drawn so tightly together they seemed ready to merge. "Anything exciting?" Edna asked. Mavis looked up. "Not unless you count my cousin Mildred's 5th engagement as a national emergency." "Depends. Has she outlived the previous 4? "She's outpaced them. Wears them out in under 2 years. This one's a dentist. Then it may last longer. They tend to be cautious people." Mavis snorted. "She's not." They stood together for a moment, the kind of silence between old friends that needed no filling. Then Edna, as casually as she could manage, said, "Have you heard any chatter about unusual garment disappearances?" Mavis narrowed her eyes. "Such as?" "Buttons," Edna said. "Gone from clotheslines. Not the whole item, just the buttons." "Buttons," Mavis repeated, chewing the word like a toffee. "Well, now that you mention it. Mrs. Bramley came in yesterday with her husband's cardigan. Claimed it fell apart at the shoulders because the buttons went missing and it lost its moral fiber. I thought she was being poetic." Edna smiled. "Possibly. But still. You think someone's stealing them?" "Not stealing, exactly," Edna said. "Taking." quietly, perhaps with purpose. That sounds like theft with extra steps. Or art, Edna offered. Millbridge isn't exactly Paris, said Mavis. We don't get many surrealists. Not many, Edna agreed. But perhaps just one. Back at home, Edna took out her button jars. She hadn't opened them in months, maybe longer, but they still lived in the same wooden cabinet beside her sewing machine. Each jar was labeled in careful script: metallics, shells, novelty, animals, wooden plus rustic, and so on. She ran her fingers through the contents of the sentimentals jar, buttons she couldn't bear to part with, each tied to some memory. One was carved from bone and had belonged to her father's waistcoat. One had a chip that looked like a crescent moon and had once been on the dress she wore the night Henry asked her to dance. She hadn't thought of that dress in years. Was it possible someone else, someone younger, perhaps lonelier, was doing the same? Collecting fragments of feeling, one button at a time? That evening, she wrote in her notebook. Theories: thief may not be malicious. Possibly nostalgic, curious, or sad. Maybe someone trying to connect to others. Or crafting something hidden. Clothing? Collage? Message? Below that, she drew a small sketch of a button tree. Just for herself. The next day brought another story. At the market, Mr. Linton, the butcher, mentioned his wife's sewing tin had gone missing entirely. It was there on Tuesday, he said, frowning. Checked Wednesday, gone. Not a needle left. And no signs of forced entry? Edna asked, tilting her head. No, but we've got that dreadful cat. Wouldn't put it past her to drag it off somewhere to birth kittens in it. Edna made a non-committal sound and tucked the note into her mind. She began walking more each day, past more clotheslines, studying the tiny domestic landscapes of Millbridge. She noticed things she'd never paid attention to: a scarf with buttons shaped like seashells, a child's cape with owls for clasps, a cardigan trimmed in fabric-covered circles the color of sand. And now and then, she'd spot one missing. A buttonless patch. An absence where something small but important should have been. By the end of the week, she had 8 recorded incidents, all with similar traits. Garments left outside. Only buttons removed. No damage or theft of the garment itself. All happened overnight or early morning. She sat down on Saturday morning and mapped them, pinpoints of strange activity across the town, like breadcrumbs. At the center of the growing spiral sat Millbridge itself. And, curiously, one road that kept appearing in overlapping circles. Lavender Lane. Where, Edna recalled, there stood a small, neglected house with peeling shutters, once owned by the Pembrokes. And now, if she remembered correctly, a quiet young man lived there. A man who rarely came into the village. A man no one quite knew. She looked at the coat hanging by the door. She smiled. She had a new walk planned for tomorrow. Chapter 3: The Young Man in the Lavender House. Lavender Lane was more of a memory than a thoroughfare. It twisted off the main road like an afterthought, paved in lichen-flecked stone and hemmed in by unruly hedges that had long since stopped asking permission to grow. Most villagers avoided it, not from fear or dislike, but because they'd simply forgotten it was there. Which, Edna thought as she turned onto it that bright Monday morning, made it precisely the sort of place a secret might choose to live. The sun was behaving unusually well for April, casting soft light through the mist like gold through milk. Edna wore her sturdy shoes and her good coat, dark green, lined with flannel, buttoned all the way up. In one pocket, she had her notebook. In the other, a parcel wrapped in linen cloth, still warm from her oven. She walked slowly, letting her gaze take in the peeling paint, the uneven garden gates, the laundry lines that sagged like tired arms. A few cats observed her from high windows with the bored disdain only cats can achieve. At the far end of the lane stood the Lavender House. It had not always been called that, but in Millbridge, names tended to evolve the way nicknames do, affectionately and without consultation. The house had once been painted a deep violet that, under the weather's gentle tyranny, had faded to something like lavender soap left too long in the dish. It wasn't abandoned, Edna knew that much. Curtains were drawn. A bicycle leaned against the fence. Smoke occasionally curled from the chimney, though not in generous amounts. She'd never seen anyone come or go, not in all her years walking past. But now, something was different. A small wooden chair sat on the front porch, and in that chair sat a young man with a basket on his lap. The basket held a rumpled tangle of cloth, and in the young man's hands was a needle. He was sewing. Not quickly or expertly, but with focused care, stitch by stitch, tongue slightly tucked in concentration. His hair was dark and uneven, as though he'd cut it himself. He wore a threadbare jumper with sleeves pushed to the elbows and had the pale, startled look of someone unaccustomed to attention. Edna watched him for a moment, hidden behind the hedge. Then, with the steadiness of someone who had already made up her mind, she stepped through the creaky gate. The boy looked up. They stared at each other. Edna smiled. "I've brought scones," she said. He blinked. She held up the parcel. Currant and orange zest. Still warm. "I'd say they're from the cafe, but they're not. I made them this morning, though I say so with no particular pride. Some things should simply be done well." The boy said nothing. She took another step forward, carefully. "I'm Edna Bell. I live over on Chapel Hill, just down past the chapel that's now a music school. You may have heard the dreadful oboe student." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Encouraged, she added, "I've walked past your house for years and never seen anyone on the porch. Now here you are sewing. Which is not something people do outside very often, and I say that as someone who once hemmed a bridesmaid's dress on a beach." Still no reply. She held out the parcel. "I won't stay, if you prefer not. But I'll leave these here." She placed it gently on the porch rail. "Consider it a thank you for giving me something to be curious about." She turned to leave, then paused. "You stitch very neatly," she said over her shoulder. "Though I'd suggest double threading for seams. Stronger hold." And then, without waiting for a response, she walked back down Lavender Lane, humming an old tune whose name she couldn't quite remember. 3 days passed. She made no effort to return, though she thought of him often. Thought of the boy's stillness, the way his hands moved as if listening to some private rhythm. Thought of the laundry basket at his feet and what might have been in it. She thought about buttons. On the 4th morning, Edna stepped into her garden and found a paper-wrapped parcel sitting on the bench by her rose bush. She paused, looked around. No one in sight. Inside the parcel were 2 things. Her linen cloth, neatly folded and clean. A hand-stitched pouch, sewn from a square of faded fabric, possibly the corner of a tablecloth. The flap was held closed by a single mother-of-pearl button. Inside the pouch, 5 buttons. Each one different. Each one lovely. One was silver, carved in filigree. One, painted with tiny forget-me-nots. One, a glossy tortoiseshell. One, plain brass with the initials HB engraved. The last, round and soft green, matched the button missing from her old garden coat. There was no note. She sat down slowly on the bench and ran her fingers over the pouch. The stitches were small, careful, slightly uneven in places. A beginner's hand, but an attentive one. A gift? A confession? An offering? That evening, Edna made more scones. She wrapped them in a different cloth, navy linen, embroidered with daisies. She added a small tin of lemon curd, sealed with wax. And, after some thought, she wrote a note. "Buttons are like punctuation. Each one carries a kind of feeling. These made me feel remembered. Thank you. E.B." She placed the parcel at the Lavender House gate and walked away without looking back. A week passed. The buttons continued to disappear. Not nightly, not even regularly, but often enough to be noticed, if one was inclined to notice such things. And Edna, now, was paying very close attention. She visited the library to check the local paper's old police reports, nothing more recent than a theft of garden gnomes in 2014. She took tea with Mrs. Anstruther, who had a theory about ghosts, always snipping things. Dear, they do love a tidy edge. She even invited Jem the greengrocer for a chat, under the pretense of needing help with her computer. It turned out he knew nothing about buttons, but had opinions on herbal tea that she found unexpectedly insightful. But most of all, Edna walked. She walked past washing lines and hedges, down alleys and up side roads, always watching for gaps in a row of buttons. Sometimes she found them. Sometimes she didn't. Sometimes she found a gift. The second pouch appeared beneath her bird feeder. This one was made from a scrap of tweed, buttoned with red plastic shaped like a star. Inside were more buttons, mismatched, lovely, odd. One had an anchor. One was square. One, made of clear resin, held a dried flower. With it, this time, a note. I didn't mean to take them at first, but some things feel like they're asking to be held. L. Just a single initial. Edna reread it 3 times. Then she put the buttons in a new jar, one she labeled Found Things, and placed it beside her others. On Sunday, she returned to the lavender house. No parcel this time. No scones. Just Edna and a question she was no longer afraid to ask. The boy was on the porch again, stitching something that looked like the cuff of a shirt. She stopped by the gate. "I'd like to sit," she said. He nodded, and she took the creaky old chair beside him. The silence stretched out comfortably, like a well-worn cardigan. Birds chirped. Wind stirred the hedges. "After a time," she said, "my husband used to collect coins. But only ones with animals on them. He said it made the world feel friendlier." The boy didn't reply, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "I think buttons might be like that," she went on. "Little invitations to notice things." He looked at her then, really looked, and his eyes were green. Quiet eyes. Not afraid, but cautious. "You don't have to explain," she said gently. "I just wanted you to know I see you." And they sat, 2 people who had not expected to be known by one another, watching the light change as afternoon softened into evening. That night, as she folded her washing and buttoned the cuffs of a blouse she hadn't worn in years, Edna realized something. She was not simply solving a mystery. She was being invited into one. And that, perhaps, was the more important thing. Chapter 4. Buttons and the Widow Fern. It is a little-known truth that mysteries do not always hide in shadows. Some sit in armchairs, sip weak tea, and grumble at the television volume. So it was with the Widow Fern. Her house stood at the edge of Millbridge, just past the mossy path where foxgloves crowded the hedges and the pavement forgot its job. It was a squat little place, more stubborn than picturesque, with ivy crawling like gossip up its sides. The curtains were always drawn, the lights always low, and the doorbell famously broken, a fact no one had tried to correct since her husband died 7 years earlier. The Widow Fern did not like company. Nor did she dislike it. She merely regarded it as unnecessary, the way one might view ornamental spoons or scented soap. But Edna Bell had known Nora Fern, née Whitlow, married to Stanley Fern, former mayor and avid coin collector, for many years. They had not been close, but they had once been cordial. And Edna, who had recently noticed that grief often did not disappear but simply changed shape, had decided it was time to renew that acquaintance. She brought lemon loaf. It seemed like a good idea. At exactly 11 o'clock, she climbed the 2 front steps of the Fern house, knocked once, firmly, with the knuckle she trusted most, and waited. Nothing. She knocked again. A long pause. Then the sound of locks, 3, by the sound of it, being unlatched in slow succession. The door creaked open. Nora Fern stared out, sharp-nosed and thin-lipped, wrapped in a shawl that may have once been plum, but had since faded to something more like surrender. "Edna," she said flatly. "Nora," Edna replied with an equally level nod. "I've brought cake." "Oomph." Nora narrowed one eye, then opened the door a half-inch wider. "Lemon. With poppy seed." A pause. "Come in then." The interior of the Fern house was dim and cool, like a church that hadn't quite forgiven you. Furniture hovered in shadow. Doilies covered most flat surfaces. A portrait of Stanley Fern, mid-speech and midpoint, hung over the fireplace like a moral warning. Nora led Edna into the sitting room and waved vaguely at a faded wingback chair. "I don't usually," she began, then stopped. "Well, sit anyway." They sat. Edna offered the lemon loaf. Nora accepted a slice, but made a show of not enjoying it too much. "This is dry," she said after a bite. "Then I've made it properly," Edna replied. Silence stretched between them like old elastic, familiar, fraying, but not yet snapped. Then Edna said, "I've been thinking about buttons." Nora glanced at her. "You're the one asking around, then." "I suppose I am. Half the village thinks it's a prank. The other half thinks it's witches." "I haven't ruled out either," Edna said lightly. "But I'm more interested in what the buttons might mean." "Mean?" "To the person taking them." Nora sniffed. "Could mean anything. Could mean nothing. Could mean memory," Edna offered. "Or mourning." At that, something shifted in the room, not visibly, but palpably, like a curtain drawing in the mind. Nora set down her slice of cake. "I suppose," she said, very quietly, "that if you'd lost someone and all you had left was their coat, a button might feel like a way to hold on." She stood then, not suddenly, but with the slow momentum of someone who has decided something. She crossed the room, unlocked a narrow cupboard, and returned with a wooden box the size of a small footstool. "This was Stanley's," she said, setting it down with care. "He collected coins, yes. But buttons too. Never told anyone. Said it was too delicate, a hobby for a man who used to cut ribbons at supermarket openings." She opened the lid. Inside were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of buttons, sorted into jars, trays, and shallow velvet-lined drawers. Some sparkled. Some were carved. Some bore insignias, others tiny flowers or nautical emblems. Edna leaned forward, astonished. "This is..." She trailed off. "He called them anchors," Nora said, eyes not on Edna but on the box. "Said every button holds something in place. Not just clothes. Stories. Moments. People." She touched a black button with a gold edge. This one was from his grandfather's coat. The old sailor. Drowned off the Scarwell cliffs. "Do you ever sew with them?" Edna asked gently. "No. I couldn't." "And yet you've kept them." Nora looked up. Her face, normally carved in severity, was softer now. "Older, too. Because they're the only things he arranged with care," she said. "Not the bills. Not the garden. Not even the wedding photos. But this he loved." They spent the next hour examining the collection. Some buttons bore the weight of history. Others were simply beautiful, glass painted from within, hand-stitched silk, delicate bone etched with initials. A few were shaped like birds. One was a perfect miniature bell, no larger than a thimble. "Would you mind," Edna asked after a while, "if I wrote some of these down? They may be connected." "Connected to what?" "To the ones disappearing." Nora considered. "You think the thief is a collector?" "I think," Edna said slowly, "that the thief is someone trying to remember things. Or perhaps someone trying to forget." Nora exhaled through her nose. "That's not very comforting." "No," Edna agreed. "But it's human." As she left the house, Edna paused beside a coat rack near the door. An old overcoat hung there, tweed, broad-shouldered, unmistakably Stanley's. Its buttons were intact. She looked at Nora, who caught her glance and said, "He wore it once a year. For the fireworks." Edna smiled. "And now?" "Now it guards the door. Same as always." They stood for a moment in a silence that was no longer elastic but woven stronger, layered with understanding. "Thank you," Edna said. Nora nodded. "Don't let the cake spoil you." Edna stepped out into the early afternoon light, her notebook thicker with meaning. Later that evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the box of buttons from Nora's house fresh in her memory. She sketched a few, pencil outlines only, with notations beneath. Black plus gold, naval history glass flower dome, fragility preserved miniature bell, joyful warning, anchor shape. Literal symbolism? She sipped her tea, jasmine this time, and allowed her thoughts to float gently downstream. If grief had shape, perhaps it was round. Perhaps it was four-holed. Perhaps it was something you stitched onto a new coat when the old one no longer fit. Maybe the person taking buttons wasn't stealing. Maybe they were collecting anchors. As she got up to turn off the kitchen light, she noticed something strange near the window. There, on the outside sill, sat a tiny, folded paper star. Crisp, precise, made from the corner of a page. She picked it up, unfolded it carefully. Inside, in tiny, delicate handwriting, were just 6 words. I didn't take it from her. No signature. No explanation. Edna stared at the note for a long time. Then she folded it again, smoothed the creases, and slipped it into her notebook. The mystery was not getting simpler, but it was becoming clearer. Chapter 5 of Umbrellas and Unsaid Things. On the 4th Thursday of April, the rain returned to Millbridge in the kind of slow, deliberate way that suggested it had every right to. The clouds moved in like dignitaries, ushered by low winds and the creak of gulls overhead. Rain here was never a fury. It was a courtesy, a soft insistence that things pause, slow down, and allow the world to steep a little. Edna Bell liked the rain. It suited the pace at which she thought. She sat at her window with her morning cup of chamomile, watching the rivulets race each other down the glass. Her cat, Buttons, curled like a question mark on the windowsill, flicking his tail whenever a drop landed with more enthusiasm than necessary. Edna had taken to carrying her notebook everywhere now. It had grown plump with sketches and notes, columns of dates, names of villagers, and a crude map of Millbridge with a trail of circled locations where Buttons had gone missing. It resembled a treasure map, if the treasure in question was memory and the trail led mostly through laundry lines and borrowed grief. Today, her next stop was the bookshop. She wasn't entirely sure why. Nothing in her notes pointed there directly. But she'd heard from Miss Pine, the organist, that Harold in the bookshop had recently replaced all the buttons on his tweed coat with mismatched ones, red, green, and even one shaped like a fish. I think he's trying to be whimsical, Miss Pine had whispered, with a tone suggesting that whimsy was one stop short of sin. Millbridge Books sat wedged between the fishmongers and a retired hat repair shop that now served exclusively as a place for arguing pigeons. The bell above the door was faint and tinkly, like a shy triangle in an orchestra. Inside, it smelled of dry paper, damp coats, and unresolved narrative tension. Harold was behind the counter, as usual, rearranging a stack of travel guides with the seriousness of someone organizing a summit. He looked up as Edna entered. Rain again. Rain still, she corrected. He smiled. We've got a new biography on Amelia Earhart. Comes with a map. Tempting, Edna replied. But I've actually come to talk buttons. He blinked. Buttons. She gestured to his coat, which hung on a peg beside a shelf of poetry. A fashion decision, he said. I grew tired of the old ones. Uniformity makes me itch. Edna smiled politely. And the fish. Harold glanced at the bright enamel trout near the collar. Whimsy, he said. Or a cry for help. Hard to tell. May I ask where you got them? Mostly the haberdashery. The fish came from a tin I found in my mother's attic. She had peculiar tastes. Edna stepped closer. Did you notice anything unusual in the past month or so? Missing buttons? Or customers asking for strange ones? Harold leaned on the counter, his expression thoughtful. Well, not buttons exactly. But I did have someone ask for a book on grief rituals in Eastern Europe. A young man, mid-20s, very polite, asked if I carried anything about mending things by hand and by heart. I said, try the poetry section. He left without buying anything. Did he say who he was? No, but he wore a raincoat, mustard yellow. Looked too big for him. I remember the buttons. Mismatched. One was shaped like a tiny compass. Edna's pulse quickened. She opened her notebook and found the page with the note she'd received at her window, the tiny origami star. I found this, she said, handing it to Harold. It was on my sill. The handwriting, anything about it looked familiar. Harold examined it. Neat. Gentle. Someone used to writing things they never send. That's a guess, mind you. That's all I have, too, Edna replied. But I have a hunch this person is not taking buttons to sell or display. They're using them to tell stories. Or to finish ones that were never ended. Harold looked at her, eyes bright behind thick lenses. You always were good at puzzles. I'm better with patchwork, she said modestly. But I think the town is speaking. Just very softly. She left the bookshop with a second-hand umbrella, navy blue, missing a spoke, and a borrowed book of poems Harold insisted might help, verses for the weathered heart. The rain followed her down the high street, but she didn't mind. The town felt alive in the wet. The gutters sang. The lampposts looked polished. And people's eyes met a little more often under shared shelter. She paused near the chapel, where the wrought iron gate always squeaked in lowercase letters. There, hunched under a tree with a red lunchbox and a pair of too short trousers, sat Frankie Drummond, age 7, hair like brambles, known for his ability to climb anything not explicitly labeled unclimbable. He waved as she passed. Good day for ducks, Edna said. Quack, he replied. She liked Frankie. You lose a button recently? She asked gently. He looked at his coat. Yeah, one off the sleeve. Dad said it's 'cause I fidget too much. But I don't think it's that. It's the ghost. Edna blinked. Ghost? Frankie nodded solemnly. Mrs. Fielding says there's a ghost that collects shiny things. Likes things with history. And did this ghost ask your permission? No. But he left me a marble. A really old one. Blue like the sea. He dug into his pocket and held it out. Edna examined it carefully. It was indeed old. The glass was bubbled inside, the swirl faint. Where did you find it? In my hood, next morning. She handed it back. Well, that's very polite of the ghost. Yeah, maybe he's sad, Frankie said. Ghosts usually are. That evening, Edna lit a candle beside her sewing box, not out of superstition, but out of reverence. She removed 3 buttons from her collection and arranged them on a napkin, one brass, one mother of pearl, one shaped like a rose. She stitched them into a strip of linen, each with a different colored thread. Then she wrapped the piece around a stone and set it at the base of her back fence, under the foxgloves. She left no note. Just the offering. Then she waited. The next morning, the strip was gone. In its place, another paper star. This one read, Some things fall off because they need to. Beneath it, 3 buttons, none of hers. All old. All beautiful. Chapter 6. The Button Tin Chronicles. By the first week of May, Edna Bell had begun thinking in buttons. She noticed them everywhere. On coats, on cushion covers, in the mouths of curious toddlers and the pockets of people who didn't even realize they were hoarding them. She saw them in the church pews, when old Mrs. Goring's cardigan snagged on a hymnal, and even in the postman's smile, he had a gap in his teeth where a button might have fit nicely. But most of all, she thought of the ones that were missing. There had been 9 disappearances now. 9 garments, 9 different households, each with 1 or more buttons gone without explanation, and, in almost every case, something left behind. A marble. A pressed flower. A scrap of notepaper with a quote from a long-forgotten book. Always small. Always strange. Always beautiful. The town was beginning to buzz in the way only small towns can. Quietly. Respectfully. Like gossip under a church hat. Millbridge has a thief, people said, but a polite one. Edna, for her part, had started conducting informal interviews, all under the guise of friendly chats and refills of tea. She never accused. She simply asked. And listened. And observed. Today, she was off to see Elsie Tumble. Elsie had been Millbridge's librarian for 47 years before retirement, and her memory for small details rivaled the parish archives. She lived in a stone cottage near the old well, with a ginger cat named Thimble and a garden full of wild mint that smelled like a misplaced memory. Edna brought a tin of shortbread and her best wool shawl. Buttons, Elsie said, pouring tea that tasted faintly of lavender. Oh, I used to keep a whole tin of them. Inherited from my mother. And her mother before that. Every button that ever fell off a thing went in there. A proper archive, really. Do you still have it? Elsie stood slowly, vanished into a back room, and returned with a tin the size of a cake pan. It rattled like treasure. They opened it together. Inside was a kaleidoscope of time. Wooden toggles, velvet-covered domes, pearlescent discs with hairline cracks. Edna picked one up, a metal button engraved with an anchor. My father's navy coat, Elsie said. Gone now. But I kept the button. Why? Elsie considered. Because it held things together. Once. They went quiet. The rain tapped politely at the window. After a moment, Edna said, Elsie, do you think it's possible someone is collecting buttons to remember people by? Not just possible, Elsie replied. It's probable. We all store our stories in objects. Some folks just know how to read them better. Edna looked down at the tin. I think our thief is trying to say something. Elsie leaned forward, the lavender in her tea rising. Maybe they're asking a question. That night, Edna brought her own button tin down from the high shelf. It had been untouched for years. It smelled of cedar and old thread. She opened it slowly. Inside were pieces of her life she'd never dared to throw away. A green glass button from her wedding blouse. A small red one from her son's baby coat, long grown out and grown gone. A golden one that matched nothing she ever owned, from a woman she once loved quietly and never quite forgot. She held it in her palm until it warmed. Then, without quite knowing why, she wrote a note. What do you want to remember? She folded it into a paper tulip, tied it with the golden button, and left it beside her gate. She didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, the tulip was gone. In its place, a button made of bone, carved with the image of a tiny house. And another note, no bigger than her thumb. The place where she last smiled. Edna placed the bone button in her notebook. She didn't write anything beside it. But for the first time in years, she opened the drawer beneath her bed, took out a bundle of old letters, and read every one. Some were from friends. Some from family. Some from the woman she'd once met on a train and never properly said goodbye to. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue, was a button. Pale pink. Mother of pearl. She had never sewn it onto anything. She held it to her chest. All right, she whispered. Let's remember then. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere in Millbridge, a clothesline stirred. Chapter 7. A String of Small Silences. It was the sort of morning Millbridge specialized in. The air smelled faintly of toast and peat, with the low sun filtered through gauze-thin clouds. Edna Bell stood in her back garden, trimming her lavender, thinking again about the silence that buttons leave behind. A missing button is a pause in a sentence, a sudden, almost imperceptible hush. And someone had been leaving quite a few pauses across Millbridge. She placed the morning's lavender cuttings in a small jug by the window and brewed a second cup of tea. Her thoughts were crowded today, jostling each other like passengers at a small-town train station. One thought kept returning like an old friend, the boy in the mustard raincoat. She hadn't seen him since Harold had mentioned him in the bookshop, but the image of him, quiet, careful, with mismatched buttons like compass points, had stitched itself into her mind. Edna decided it was time to pay a visit to someone she hadn't seen in years, Mr. Nathaniel Reed. Nathaniel was a former teacher and widower who lived in a narrow red brick house on the edge of the coastal path. He had once taught creative writing at the village school and was now known mostly for his long walks, his devotion to wild birds, and his near-obsessive journaling. If anyone in Millbridge knew how to read between the lines of silence, it was Nathaniel. She found him feeding breadcrumbs to a congregation of starlings. Edna Bell, he said, as if her name were the first line of a novel he'd forgotten he'd started. Still threading mysteries into your days? More than ever, she replied. Mind if I ask you something unusual? He gestured to the garden bench. Only if I may respond with an equally unusual answer. She smiled. It's about buttons. Go on. She told him everything. The disappearances, the replacements, the strange small gifts. The notes. The bone button. The boy with the yellow coat. Nathaniel listened without interruption, his fingers steepled, his breath soft as old paper. When she finished, he said, "You know, when my wife died, I kept one of her buttons. Just one. From a dress she never wore because she never liked the color. But she laughed every time she saw it in the closet, and that laugh, it stitched into the button." Edna's eyes welled. "Do you still have it?" He nodded. "In my journal. Taped to the page." "Why?" "Because I still want to talk to her. And sometimes I think she listens better through small things." They sat for a long moment. Finally, Edna asked, "Do you know a boy mid-20s, quiet, mustard coat, buttons like a map?" Nathaniel tilted his head. "That sounds like Leo." "Leo?" "My nephew's son. Moved back a few months ago. Grief brought him home. He lost someone." "Does he collect things?" "He always did. Stories mostly. But also keys, bottle caps, stamps. Once he spent a summer collecting feathers from birds he could name. Polite boy. Fragile, in the way some precious things are." "Do you think he's the one?" Nathaniel didn't answer directly. Instead, he stood and walked to a small tin nailed to a shed. Inside it were feathers, folded poems, and, yes, a single button. Bright green. Edna recognized it from the coat Mrs. Harwood had worn to church just last week. "He's leaving messages," Nathaniel said softly. "But not just for others. For himself." Breadcrumbs out of the forest. Edna felt something unspool gently inside her. "Do you know where I can find him?" Nathaniel smiled. "He walks the cliffs most mornings. Carries a thermos and always wears that same coat. You'll see him if you look for the pauses." That evening, Edna didn't write a note. She didn't leave a button. She simply walked. She passed by the church, the bakery, the house with the overgrown piano garden. She wandered until the sky turned velvet and the sea began whispering louder than the wind. And there, on the old bench by the path, was a folded note. No string. No name. She opened it slowly. Not everything needs fixing. Some things just need remembering. She pressed it to her heart. Tomorrow, she would find him. But tonight, she simply let herself sit with the silence. Chapter 8. The Boy in the Mustard Coat. The morning that followed came dressed in mist. The sea was a vague suggestion behind a curtain of white, and the gulls, usually brash and busy, seemed to whisper rather than shriek. Edna Bell, scarf tied tight beneath her chin, walked the coastal path with her walking stick tapping a soft rhythm on the earth. She was looking for a boy in a mustard coat. Not a boy, she reminded herself. A young man, really. Leo. The cliffs were slick from the night's drizzle, the gorse heavy with water, but Edna walked with care and certainty. She passed the bench from the night before. Empty. No new notes. No buttons. Just mist and a faint warmth where memory had been. Half an hour passed before she saw him. He was seated at the edge of the cliffs, legs tucked, thermos in hand, staring out into the invisible horizon. The mustard coat looked too big for him, the buttons mismatched, each one a different size, color, and shape. Like collected thoughts sewn into fabric. Edna approached slowly. "Hello," she said gently. Leo turned. He had a face like morning light, pale, soft, not quite awake. "Hello. I'm Edna Bell." "I know," he said. "I've been hoping you'd find me." She sat beside him. "I believe," she said, "we have some things to talk about." He unscrewed his thermos and poured a second cup of tea from a collapsible tin mug. Offered it. She took it. Sipped. Chamomile and lemon balm. "You're the button thief," she said, not unkindly. Leo's lips twitched, not into a smile exactly, but something smaller. "Yes." "Why?" He drew a breath, the kind people take when they aren't sure if they're about to speak or cry. I lost someone, he said. Her name was Mira. We used to talk about how people leave pieces of themselves behind in things. That memories are stored not in brains, but in buttons and forks and books and stones. We used to leave tiny treasures for each other everywhere. I've been trying to keep that alive. And the notes. She wrote them. I found a box of them after she died. Little thoughts, folded and tucked into odd places. I've been pairing them with buttons that feel right. Edna's heart squeezed in her chest. It's not theft, he said. Not really. I always leave something behind. Something worth more, I hope. You do, Edna said softly. You do. They sat in silence, the kind that felt whole, not broken. I thought, Leo said, that maybe I could stitch people's memories back together. Or at least, remind them they were there. Edna nodded slowly. You've done that. For me. For many of us. He blinked quickly. I don't know what to do next. Edna smiled. Perhaps you let the buttons lead you. They're cleverer than we give them credit for. They sat a while longer, sharing tea and silence. And when Edna stood to go, Leo handed her a button, wooden, painted with a forget-me-not. For your tin, he said. She held it tight. For Mira, she whispered. And then, with her heart full of stitched stories, she walked back toward Millbridge. Chapter 9. Threads of Return. The town of Millbridge, in the pale cradle of early summer, had begun to feel like something newly mended. The kind of quiet, contented hum that lives in a well-loved cardigan after the final stitch. The mystery of the missing buttons hadn't ended, not quite, but it had shifted from a whisper of suspicion into a murmur of meaning. And now Edna Bell had a name. Leo. A face, too. The boy, or rather, the young man, in the mustard coat with mismatched buttons and a heart full of memory. He was no longer a shadow on the edge of her thoughts. He was a person with hands that trembled when offering stories, and eyes that held entire oceans of lost things. Still, there was something incomplete. Not in Leo, but in the path they'd begun together. Something unsaid. Something unstitched. So, Edna invited him to tea. She spent the morning preparing her house with the quiet diligence of someone expecting someone important. She polished the teapot, folded napkins into neat squares, and even baked a cherry scone she hadn't made in years. Her parlor, rarely used for guests anymore, was filled with the scent of lemon polish, bergamot, and thread. She had placed a small linen cloth on the table, and in the center, her button tin. Leo arrived promptly at 3. He had brushed his hair, she noticed. And his coat, still stitched with odd buttons like punctuation marks in a private language, had been freshly laundered. Come in, she said. You're just in time for the second steep. The afternoon unfolded gently. They spoke of small things at first. Birds. Scones. Whether the sea was louder in the morning or at night. And then, like a ripple growing into a wave, the conversation deepened. Edna told him about her son, once small and curious, now far away and unwritable. She spoke of her late husband, whose buttons had always been loose, but whose love had been firm. She told Leo about the woman she met on a train, the one who had smiled like spring and left a single pink button behind. Leo, in turn, spoke of Mira. She believed in invisible threads, he said, that we're all tied to each other by them. And when we lose someone, we don't really lose them, the thread just stretches further. That's why I leave the notes. The buttons. They're like breadcrumbs for the heart. Edna reached into her tin and pulled out the golden button she'd never sewn. She placed it gently on the table between them. This was hers, she said. Leo touched it with reverence. She would have liked that it found its way back into a story, he said. Then he pulled something from his coat pocket, a small wooden frame, inside of which was a collection of buttons, a navy one, a green glass one, a pink mother of pearl, each held in place with thin gold thread. It's not for display, he said. It's for remembering. Edna's breath caught. Would you help me make more? He asked. She looked at the frame, at the golden button, at the boy with Myra's heart tucked behind his ribs. Yes, she said. I think I would like that very much. That evening, after Leo had gone, Edna sat by the window with the button frame on her lap. She threaded a new needle, tied a knot in the end, and began to sew a border around the forget-me-not button he'd given her. Outside, the breeze played with the chimes over her garden gate. Inside, the ticking of her old wall clock joined in. For the first time in a very long while, Edna felt not just useful, but connected. As though the invisible thread Mira believed in had been tugged gently, and she had tugged back. Before bed, Edna penned a note of her own. No button, no paper flower, just a simple square of thick cardstock, folded once. The threads are still there. We just have to follow them. She tucked it into her coat pocket. Tomorrow, she would leave it by the library steps. A gift, a nudge, a clue. And as she turned off the light and slipped between her sheets, she imagined a world held together by buttons. Not stitched out of necessity, but out of remembrance. Millbridge slept, and the quiet wind carried stories between houses, slipping through keyholes and under doors, gently rethreading what had once come undone. Chapter 10: A Map of Lost Things. Morning in Millbridge was a hymn, soft and slow, sung by the tide as it pulled lace-edged foam across the pebbled shore. Birds stitched through the sky with carefree loops, and the village yawned to life with the creak of shutters and the whistle of kettle spouts. Edna Bell, wrapped in a shawl the color of thistle, stepped outside with her letter tucked into one pocket and a blue button sewn to her cuff like a quiet promise. She made her way to the library steps, where she tucked the folded card beneath a loose brick she'd once helped mortise as a young woman. The brick had always shifted when pressed on the left side, useful for stashing chocolates during market day, or, in this case, small messages meant for those who paid attention. By noon, she was back at her shop, thimble perched like a crown on her finger, threading a series of plum-colored buttons onto an old fishing net Leo had found washed ashore. They were making something together now, something that wasn't just art or memory or even grief, but a kind of map. A map of lost things. It's like a tide chart, Leo said. But for feelings. Edna smiled. Or breadcrumbs through the woods. They were quiet for a while, working in tandem, the rhythm of needle and thread keeping time like a metronome for unspoken thoughts. I wonder, she said eventually, how many people have buttons they never told stories about. Leo looked up. What if we asked them? So they did. That afternoon, they posted a sign in the window of Edna's shop. Have a button with a story? Tell us over tea. It was handwritten, in Edna's looping script, and surrounded by a border of real buttons glued like candy to the edge of the paper. A cherry red one. A brass one shaped like a tulip. A pale translucent green like sea glass. At first, there were only curious glances. Then, on the third day, Mrs. Armitage from the corner bakery brought in a gray button with a tiny etched rabbit on it. This was on my mother's apron, she said. The one she wore when she taught me to bake. It popped off the day she taught me how to knead without looking down. On the fifth day, an older man with a soft-spoken Scottish accent brought a small tin soldier's button. My brother gave me this before he left for the war, he said, voice thick. Said it would keep me brave. Then came children with buttons from costumes, a teenager with a coat button from her first breakup, a woman with a shimmering shell disc from a dress she wore to scatter her father's ashes at sea. Each button was sewn to the net, carefully and with reverence. Each one was labeled in delicate script on a linen tag. The net began to grow. And as it grew, people began to gather. To talk. To remember. The space between Edna's shop and the bakery became a small plaza of recollection. Folding chairs appeared. So did pots of tea. It wasn't just a project anymore. It was a gathering place. A new part of Millbridge's soul. One evening, as they tacked the final buttons of the day to the growing tapestry, Leo paused and held up a square of parchment. Do you recognize this name? He asked. Edna squinted. The name was scrawled in blue fountain pen ink, Eleanor Merriweather. I haven't heard that name in years, she said slowly. She used to live on Lantern Hill. Do you think she's still here? Edna pursed her lips. She was a very private woman. Bit of a mystery. But kind. The note had come with a single black button shaped like a rose. She said, Leo added, that it was her mother's. And that her mother had one sewn for someone important. They visited Lantern Hill the next day. The cottage, perched like a stooped cat against the sky, had ivy climbing its bones and shutters that blinked at the sea. Edna knocked gently. After a long pause, the door opened a cautious inch. Yes, said a voice like parchment. Miss Merriweather? Yes. We came about the button, Edna said. The one with the rose. The door opened wider. Eleanor Merriweather was thin and sharp-eyed, her white hair coiled in a bun as tidy as a treble clef. I thought you might, she said. Come in. But quietly, if you can. The past doesn't like to be startled. Inside, the house was a museum of shadows and scent, lavender, cedar, old paper. And in the center of the parlor sat a small, worn trunk. Eleanor opened it. Inside were swatches of fabric, photographs, love letters in French, and a collection of buttons so beautiful and strange that Edna gasped. My mother, Eleanor said softly, was a seamstress in Paris before the war. She made gowns for women who never wore the same dress twice. And these? Leo asked. Each one from a dress she altered. She kept them as memories. Edna touched a button shaped like a teardrop. This one. That belonged to Josephine Baker. Edna and Leo stared. She kept it, Eleanor said, because Josephine told her that clothes carry the ghosts of the nights we wore them. Eleanor reached into the trunk and removed a small silk pouch. I want you to have these, she said. We couldn't, Edna began. You can, she said, firmly. Stories aren't meant to be kept in trunks. They're meant to be shared, sewn back into the world. That night, Edna added a rose-shaped button to the net. Beside it, she stitched a tiny linen tag that read, Paris, music, memory. And Millbridge, once so quiet and folded inward, stretched just a little further, as if making room. The map of lost things was growing. And Edna knew some of the buttons they'd yet to find would unlock entire lifetimes. Tomorrow, they would begin again. With tea. And thread. And the courage to ask about the smallest things, the things we keep in tins, in drawers, in memory. Because sometimes, that's where the story begins. Chapter 11. The Wind Carries Names. Millbridge was waking into the kind of day that felt borrowed from a storybook, light curling around chimney pots, cobblestones still damp from a midnight rain, and the air thick with a promise that something forgotten might yet be remembered. In Edna Bell's shop, the button net now spanned nearly the entire west wall, catching the morning light like stained glass. Buttons glinted like tiny moons, each one bearing a story. They had become more than tokens. They were symbols, invitations, confessions. That morning, Edna found a note tucked beneath the shop's door. No name, just a line written in firm script. She wore red buttons on the day she left. Below it, inside a small cloth pouch, was a single red button shaped like a tiny heart. Edna took the note to Leo, who had begun spending more of his hours in the shop than not. He sat on a stool near the window, winding thread around old wooden bobbins like it was the most important job in the world. He read the note and looked up slowly. It sounds like a goodbye. Or the beginning of one, Edna said. They pinned the note beside the heart-shaped button, just beneath a mother-of-pearl disc from a widower's wedding vest. The stories were starting to echo, overlapping like song verses sung out of order, but in harmony. We might need a book, Edna said, to write them all down. Leo nodded. A catalog of memory. They began recording them that very day, each button paired with its story, carefully copied into a leather-bound ledger Edna had once used for customer orders. She wrote in ink the color of dried marigolds, and Leo illustrated each page with small drawings, a spool of thread, a hand, a cup of tea. One afternoon, a girl no older than 10 came in with her grandmother. The girl held a pale blue button with both hands, as if it were fragile. "It's from my mom's coat," she said. "The one she wore when she picked me up from school every day. She died last winter." Edna crouched beside her, her hands resting lightly on her knees. "Would you like us to keep it safe?" The girl nodded. Leo helped her sew it onto the net, guiding her fingers as if they were sharing a secret code. When it was done, the girl stood back and smiled. Later, Leo whispered, "Some stories only need a few words." The button net became known unofficially as the Wind Wall, named after a poem someone had tacked beside it. "We are stitched by wind and fastened with small things, buttons, sighs, glances, and names." Visitors came more frequently now, not only from Millbridge but from nearby villages. A woman from Windmere left a silver button from her first opera gown. A boy from Tithecombe offered one shaped like a fish from his father's fishing vest. And then one morning, a man arrived with a violin case and a single button made of ebony. "This," he said, "was my brother's. He played violin on the ferry between here and Debmouth. People tossed coins into his case, but he said the best tip he ever got was when a lady sewed this button onto his collar and told him he played like the sea." Edna carefully tied it beside the cherry red button Mrs. Armitage had once brought. She did not need to say what she was thinking. This net was no longer simply stitched, it was sung. The ledger began to fill. And with each entry, Edna noticed something. People were starting to visit each other again. Conversations bloomed. Neighbors who had once passed in silence now lingered at the net, remembering things aloud, swapping tea cake recipes and old rumors. The plaza outside Edna's shop became a living room, open to the sky. One man even began bringing a small kettle and folding table, offering cardamom tea in chipped porcelain cups. Children tied ribbons to the posts. Someone had drawn a chalk border around the whole area and written in curly letters, "The Threaded Place." And Edna? She felt herself loosening too. There were fewer silences, fewer aches. Her hands still trembled when she threaded needles, but it was no longer from sadness. It was something else now, eagerness. A desire to mend. That night, as the sky blushed coral and the shop began to dim, Leo pulled a folded letter from his coat. "I think this one's for you," he said. Edna took it. Inside was a crisp note, written in a script that trembled only slightly. "I once left behind a blue velvet coat on purpose, because it reminded me too much of you. But the buttons? I kept them. I still do. M." Her heart hiccuped. M. She turned the paper over. Taped to the back was a single deep blue button, smooth and round, the color of dusk just before the stars come. Leo didn't ask. He didn't have to. "I'll sew this one myself," Edna whispered. She did, later that evening, by lamplight. Her hands steady, her eyes full. The wind picked up as she stitched. And for a moment, it sounded almost like a name being carried across the rooftops. A name she hadn't heard in decades, but had never truly forgotten. Tomorrow, she would walk the path past the old railway bridge. But tonight, she simply listened. To the wind. To the thread. To everything beginning again. Chapter 12, Where the Tracks Disappear. The next morning arrived with a hush. Fog rolled in from the coast, softening the edges of everything: rooftops, hedges, even the crows on the church steeple. It was the kind of mist that made people speak in quieter voices, as though the world were listening more closely. Edna Bell wrapped a woolen scarf twice around her neck and packed a tin of biscuits into her satchel. Then she picked up the note from M again, read it once more, and slipped it carefully into the front pocket. Leo appeared just as she was locking up the shop. "You're going," he said. Edna nodded. "To the railway bridge. Want company?" "I think I'd best go alone." Leo didn't press her. He only handed her a small thermos and said, "Tea for the road." The railway bridge lay just beyond the bramble-thick fields north of Millbridge, where the tracks had long since been torn up. Only the stones remained, standing like ribs of an old shipwreck, weathered and tufted with moss. Edna hadn't walked that path in years. Not since the last letter from Malcolm had gone unanswered. Not since the day she'd chosen to remain in Millbridge, mending other people's hearts while tucking her own into storage. As she walked, she passed the old windmill, now nothing more than a skeleton of its former self. She paused to press her hand against one of its beams. "You remember," she murmured, and the wood, creaking faintly, seemed to agree. Further down the lane, she came to the place where the path forked, one way toward the sea, the other toward the bridge. She took the latter, boots squelching gently in the dew-wet earth. The bridge emerged slowly from the fog like a sleeping giant. Tufts of grass grew from its crevices. The iron railing had long since rusted, and the wooden planks were silvered with time. She crossed it slowly, each step echoing faintly. And when she reached the middle, she stopped. For a moment, all was still. Then, with fingers trembling more from memory than cold, Edna took the note from her pocket. "I know you came here," she said softly, her voice slipping into the mist. "I can feel it still. You used to hum that waltz, remember?" She closed her eyes and hummed the first few notes. The sound wove through the fog like thread through fabric. And then, as if summoned by that very melody, she heard it, a second voice. Soft, distant. A violin, tentative but clear, playing the same waltz. Her eyes flew open. No one. Only mist and birdsong. She laughed. Not out of mockery or disbelief, but from something deeper recognition. She sat on the bridge's edge and poured herself a cup of Leo's tea. It was still warm, scented faintly with bergamot and clove. As she sipped, she reached into her coat and pulled out a single button. The blue one. M's button. She ran her thumb across its surface, thinking of what might have been, what still could be. Then she tied it to the bridge's railing with a loop of gold thread she kept always in her pocket. Not as an offering, not even as a goodbye, but as a place marker for a heart that had finally made the journey. Above her, gulls wheeled and called. Below, the stream whispered over pebbles worn smooth by time. When she rose to leave, she turned once more to look back. A second button now hung beside hers. Wooden. Familiar. Malcolm's. She didn't cry. She only smiled. That evening, she returned to the shop to find Leo asleep in the window seat, curled around a patchwork quilt. The kettle had gone cold. A button lay balanced on the edge of his sketchbook, a daisy-shaped one from his sister's raincoat. Edna kissed the top of his head and quietly began preparing supper. Millbridge glowed in the soft blue of twilight. The button net swayed gently in the breeze, 1,000 stories whispering in the hush of evening. Something had shifted. Not finished, not ended, but unlocked. And far away, on a railway bridge nobody used anymore, 2 buttons hummed softly in the wind. Chapter 13. The Button Tree. The summer fair arrived with the scent of roasted chestnuts and sea salt curling through the air. Bunting was strung from lamppost to lamppost, fluttering like the laughter of children. The square pulsed with music and warmth, and for once, Millbridge felt less like a sleepy coastal village and more like a gathering place of memories. Edna Bell stood beside the community bulletin board with her arms crossed over her apron. Leo was arranging his little art stall nearby, painting quick watercolor portraits of curious fairgoers. His easel leaned at a jaunty angle, the same way his father's old pipe used to sit in the corner of his mouth. She watched a girl with purple-tipped braids buy a postcard. Watched a man sell wind chimes made of driftwood and glass. Watched and felt the rhythm of the town settle around her like a shawl. All around them, buttons glinted. They were everywhere now. Tucked into garlands, pinned to ribbons, looped through cuffs. Even Leo had taken to decorating his hat with a cluster of tiny ones, a quiet tribute. No one had caught the button thief. Not formally. But no one was really trying anymore. Because somewhere along the way, the stealing had stopped feeling like a crime. The town had decided, in its quiet and peculiar way, that it had been something else entirely. A gathering. a stitching together. Ladies and gentlemen, called the mayor, standing on a painted crate, I present to you the button tree. Gasps and chuckles rippled through the crowd as a curtain was drawn back, revealing a modest apple tree transplanted to the center of the square. Its limbs were bare of leaves, but covered in buttons, hundreds of them, tied with threads, ribbons, even fishing line. A silver thimble tinkled in the breeze where a bird might have once perched. A green button from Edna's childhood coat dangled from a high branch. It was Leo's idea, Edna murmured. He blushed. Well, yours, really. I just painted it. The townsfolk began stepping forward, one by one, to add their own. Buttons from baby clothes, from old uniforms, from lovers long gone. The tree accepted them all. That evening, after the stalls were packed away and the lanterns lit the square with a golden hush, Edna stayed behind. She wandered to the button tree and sat on the little bench Leo had carved beneath it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a final button. It was pearl white with a single crack across the center, the last of Malcolm's coat. She tied it to the tree's lowest branch. Then, for the first time in a long while, she cried. Quiet tears, the kind that wash gently rather than break. I missed you, she whispered to the wind. The leaves rustled, though there were none. A moth passed, ghost-like, over the buttons, its wings catching a glint of moonlight. Weeks passed. Millbridge settled into the slow embrace of early autumn. The button tree remained. Children hung tiny stories from its limbs. Tourists asked about it and were told, vaguely, that it had something to do with love and laundry. Leo started a small publication called The Thread, sharing stories from townsfolk and collecting button poems. Edna returned to her sewing table, not as a woman hiding, but as one returned. And every week, she taught a class at the community hall, sewing, mending, and listening. People tell you things when you fix their clothes, she told Leo. It's a kind of honesty, born from fabric. The mystery of the button thief? It never quite left. But it no longer needed solving. Not when it had mended so much. On the first frost of the season, Edna found a note on her doorstep. It read, "Thank you for finding me." Below it, a button. Deep blue. The first that had ever gone missing. She didn't chase the sender. Didn't need to. Some stories, after all, are best left with a few threads unknotted. She tucked the note into her recipe book and smiled. Millbridge slept peacefully that night. And high above the town square, in the button tree that had once been bare, 1,000 tiny stories rustled in the dark, whispering that things lost are often never really gone. Only waiting to be found. The end.
Thanks for listening. Stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next story.